Hi guys, Artie here, and today I'll be reviewing Dan vs. Season 1, Episode 7, Traffic. Where Dan, frustrated with the city's gridlocked traffic, drags along his friend Chris with him in his quest to get rid of traffic for once and for all. I think it's about time I review an episode of Dan vs., one of the most underrated cartoons of the 2010s, if not of all time. Maybe if this video gets enough views, I'll review Dan vs. New Mexico, the first episode of the series. I chose to review Dan vs. Traffic first since it has an interesting and relatable premise. Well, to be fair, almost every Dan vs. episode is meant to be relatable, but not many people seem to talk about this one. The episode starts with Dan trying to race home from the movie theater after drinking too much soda, but the traffic in Los Angeles obviously is terrible and is the only thing that rivals their homeless crisis and high crime rate. No matter how many detours he takes, he is stopped by something stupidly inconvenient and he is unable to get home in time and eventually pisses himself. At one point, a cop pulls him over and asks why he's driving on the sidewalk and completely understands Dan's emergency, letting him off the hook immediately. I wish my area had more police like this. Chris gets home from work and discovers that Elise is making a chemical in their kitchen for the government agency she works for that gives people vertigo for several months if inhaled. Except that Chris is never aware about her working for a secret government service, despite her almost admitting it several times. The chemical canisters will come into play later on in the episode. Meanwhile, Dan resorts to illegally and funnily closing off a major exit himself without permission, and pretending to be a construction worker to reduce traffic. Chris is dumb enough to fall for the disguise, and eventually finds out it's Dan when he yells at him for not listening. He tells him to get in his car, and refuses until he sees a police cruiser approaching. Dan and Chris continue to argue about ways to get rid of traffic, and Chris suggests public transportation. Dan makes a good point about bus people usually being dirty and how he'll still be in traffic, but on a bus. I don't think Dan understands how bad public transportation is in other countries like India, where hundreds of people literally sit on the roof of trains if the carriage runs out of room. One of the most memorable scenes in this episode is when Dan calls Chris's work phone and demands him to leave work and come over to help with his plan, and Chris responds with "nuh-uh," and then Dan tells him, "What do you mean nuh-uh?" Chris finally stops by Dan's apartment after work to discuss a plan. Dan suggests a homemade jetpack that doesn't work, and Chris again suggests public transportation since less vehicles driving means less traffic. Also, this scene right here should become a meme.
Is it possible that somehow, with your pathetic intellect, that you actually contributed something positive to this endeavor?
This gives Dan the wrong idea and he steals explosives, or should I say borrows them, using this term loosely here, from Wally's Hardware and Explosives Emporium and attempts to blow up a car dealership. Chris eventually convinces Dan that blowing up cars is not the solution, but it is too late and the bomb timer is accidentally set off. Dan and Chris get in the car and pull out of the lot at the last second, watching the gigantic explosion behind them. The car apocalypse. After admitting to Elise what they've done, she and Chris go to Dan's place to have a serious talk with him over his actions, where they find out Dan's final strategy. They play a VHS tape where Dan tells him he found out about Elise's chemicals and claims he will release them over the city since people cannot drive with vertigo, thus eliminating traffic. Upon returning to their home, the canisters are missing and they figure he is at the radio station to find the helicopter and release the chemical agents. Meanwhile, Dan finally kicks Helicopter Hal's ass for bragging on the radio about how he likes traffic and he can simply fly over it when doing the traffic report throughout the episode. He then forces him to fly the helicopter and Elise catches up using a special government-issued aircraft to stop Dan's plan. At the end of the episode, Dan takes control of the helicopter to evade Elise, but crashes it. It turns out Dan dropped only one canister that landed in Bakersfield, California, and Elise retrieved the rest. So his revenge plan ended up failing with unintended consequences, so it kind of worked in a way, I guess. Several scenes had laugh-out-loud quotes, and I found the plot about bad traffic very relatable. I found the quote in the beginning where Dan shouts, "Don't you people have jobs?" relatable and funny. It isn't even rush hour yet and the traffic is at a standstill. Nearly every minute of this episode had some outlandish or laugh-out-loud funny scene or quote. It would take all day to discuss each and every one, like how a sock laying in the middle of the road caused a traffic jam in the first place. Also how Dan wouldn't let Chris drive away from the impending explosion unless he put on his seatbelt. Overall, I can confirm this is an excellent episode. Dan loses in this episode and is unable to defeat traffic, but I still think the plot works because he still gets revenge on Helicopter Hal for being annoying and arrogant, and also because Dan doesn't suffer that harsh of a consequence, only being tasered by Elise at the end of the episode. Not to mention this episode is jam-packed with jokes and awesome line deliveries every minute. I like how the show balances out Dan's characterization perfectly so he's a likable anti-hero despite his irrational behavior. You can see why he does these elaborate, crazy revenge schemes, but in the long run doesn't want to actually kill or seriously injure anybody. He knows right from wrong. It's a real shame this show ended way too soon. The only thing I didn't like about this episode is that there was a suggestive deleted scene of someone tied to a bed right before Chris and Lee started the tape. It should have been left in the episode and would have implied something much funnier. Thank you for watching. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, share, notify, and check out other videos on the channel. You may like them. Do you agree that this episode is pretty good? Or do you believe this episode is lacking in some areas just like how Dan's plan worked out? Let me know in the comments. Also, thank you for 400 subscribers. I'm going to strive to get 500 subs before 2024.